Welcome to another Founder Wisdom Pod with Nicholas Samstag. Dr. Nicholas Samstag is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. So we're going to talk about therapy today. We're going to talk about high performance and how Dr. Nicholas is helping us perform better and or is helping us go through the challenges of life, especially since COVID, which had huge ripples on the planet Earth, and yeah, especially people that are in the entrepreneurial field that are founding business or are in top executive roles. Things have got a bit more stressful lately. This podcast is brought to you by podbar.com. If you want to start, scale, be invited to podcasts like this one, you can Google Charles Cormier or go to podbar.com. Nicholas, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and about your practice.
Well, thanks very much, Charles. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think it's exciting to have an opportunity to talk about how more than ever we need to slow down a bit. I was just reading an article in the Times about a group of people who are studying the effects of attention, and they found that there's something like 47 teachers and educators who found that there's something like 47 seconds of attention that they can count on in the daily course, which is bad. So yeah, I'm a bit of a dinosaur in a way. I mean, what I provide is a long-term service for people to engage in their psychology and to understand how their past experiences, primarily developmental history, have impacted where they are today. It takes a long time. It's expensive. It's very much not in keeping with the deluge of information and factoids that we're surrounded by. So that's what I do, and I've worked with people from high finance to much more modest folks, and there's nothing more profitable than being psychologically clear. So that's what I
agree
do.
with that, because we carry that with us pretty much everywhere we go. And you and I, we talked about some folks that you worked with. You're in the financial district in New York, so you work with people that usually take big bets and are all about risk management. Also entrepreneurs, founders, and so forth. So what challenges do these folks often face? For example, on my side, I have stress for sure. Happiness has never been an issue. Stress has not. Also, I mean, at time it does resurface and gets quite intense, but I think that's pretty normal and cyclical. And I don't think my psychology normally affects adversely my business. I do think though that I could think clearer and get way more upsides. But what challenges do your client face most of the time?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the general my general response to that is that people in the financial world, people who are striving and succeeding and doing great things, are often unaware of the more deeper, more nuanced aspects of human communication. So, for example, one of the differential diagnoses that I make always is to try to understand the level of, you mentioned stress, understand the level of stress in light of what is reported, right? So if you're working 90 hours a week, that's stressful, certainly. But how you interpret that stress is up to you. How you interpret the kinds of stress you have is up to you. One of my favorite philosophers is a man named Richard Rorty, who years ago wrote a lot of interesting things about how human experience is essentially an interpretation. And I think that's true. I mean, I do believe there are facts, and there's time limits and there are limits to things we do. But when stress is used as a generic term and stops there, I don't think we learn anything. So are you stressed out because you're running some scenario in your head about how your boss or your coworkers don't like you? Is your stress, on the other hand, simply about the fact that you just need more sleep? People have done a lot of great things under stress, and they've also gotten very sick under stress. And I think one of the differences between those two examples is that the person who's more psychologically aware of themselves doesn't mistake the concrete for the symbolic. Doesn't mistake the fact that they're working too hard with some notion that they're inferior, or their boss is angry at them, that sort of thing.
Right. I'm seeing here on your website, you also do couples therapy. I guess the couples often in high performers, they take the back seat, So how do high performers perform in the couple and relationship areas of things usually, and what challenges can they be facing there?
That's another great question. I think high-powered couples tend to compete with one another more than less high-powered couples. I mean, to be high-powered, just to say this, doesn't mean superior. It just means, people are ambitious, they're driven, they want to be the top of their game. And I think the interpersonal world of romance and friendships and colleagues is infinitely more complicated than the professional world. There's a lot less to hide behind. There are fewer obvious rules. So I think the first thing I do, I love doing couples, but the first thing I try to do is assess what the actual couple is. Typically, couples come in and person A will say that it's person B's fault, and person B will say that it's person A's fault. And so what happens immediately is we have to start understanding why we're blaming one another instead of communicating on more productive levels. But I think one of the through lines I find with couples and individuals is that we're often in the wrong conversations with one another. We've all had fights with our friends and lovers and family members over stupid things. Someone forgets to take out the garbage, or someone doesn't buy enough ice cream, and we all get very angry and bent out of shape about that. And as obvious as this is, many people really can't deconstruct that conversation and say, wait a minute, this is not about ice cream, it's about something else. It's about the fact that you hurt my feelings, or you did this, or I feel that, or I'm sick and I can't tell you something more meaningful. So I think, on a complicated and straightforward level, what I try to do is try to find better conversations. And I think once you do that, once you even start thinking about that, like what conversations are you actually having with people? And ask yourself, are they interesting? Are they meaningful? Have you learned anything? Do you have anything to say? I mean, that's a hard thing to say to somebody. And it's even harder to say to yourself, like, what do you have to say? And why are you saying it to this particular person at this particular time? I had a couple just recently, yesterday, in fact, he of the she said that that when they woke up in the morning, his wife turned to him and said, I had a dream that I was really angry at you. And he said, why on earth would you tell me that? I just woke up, right? One can wonder about that sort of thing, right?
And or sometimes it's like, yeah, sexual dreams, but yeah, I guess a challenge can often be to not spend enough time with one another in couples. Quite often busy. We get into routines as well. Routines that help us be more productive, get on track with our goals, but sometimes it can lead to boredom as well. How do you spice it up on that level?
I think the most direct way to spice it up, or to become more interested in it, is to actually be curious about the other person's experience. How are you doing? What's it like being, I say to Charles Cormier, what's it like being you? What gets you up in the morning? What's your best part of the day? What's your worst part of the day? What do you wish you'd rather not be doing? We're not, I think, again, we live in a very fast-paced, gluttonous world of information. And most of us, as I said when we started, I think most of us have to learn how to slow down. And it's really, when people come into my office and I simply ask them how you're doing, they're often startled because nobody asks them that. It's all about, and it's great. Ambition can be great, and being the best you can be and all of that. I'm all for that, of course. Let's be the best we can be. But let's not forget about what our experience is. How often is it that anyone asks us, how's it going? Instead of, anodyne conversations about, how much money did we make, or, bullshit, really, forgive the phrase, but, the holidays are a problem often for people because they don't spend any time the rest of the year getting to really know one another or what's happening. So there you are, thrown together with Uncle Harry, whom you haven't spoken to in 12 months, and he's completely different than you are. You don't know anything about him, and you have to have a conversation, and the conversation is typically about, so the weather's been really cold up here lately, right? And so I think it's not the holidays that are the problem. It's the days between.
Yeah. Sometimes these are awkward times for introverted folks or folks like me that just don't like that small talk, and aren't interested if it's not a conversation involving risk or controversial aspects, or at least smart convos that I can get IQ points. So need to work that empathy muscles. And yeah, I was reflecting on that, with my friends yesterday. I touch base with them like once a year, maybe during holidays, and we're like, hey, how's been the year? And then like after that, we spend a full year just crunching down work, and then we check in on one another. It would be nice to have more frequent check-in. I think that's something that, yeah, I've been neglecting on my side lately, physical community and building that. Can you talk about, yeah, the social rift that COVID has created in part, right, in the last year, and how the lack of community can affect the well-being of someone?
Yeah, I think COVID gave us an excuse to isolate. I think it also, on a not that there's anything positive per se about COVID, obviously, but I think the notion that we don't have to go to the office if we don't want to has been a great positive thing. But to answer your question, I think it's made it hard for a lot of people who are, let's say, introverted or shyer or more driven, let's say. It's been harder because you're not forced to go to the office. You're not necessarily put together with people. And we need people. We're social creatures, unless we live on a mountaintop by ourselves. I mean, we by and large need people. And we need, I think need to is a way of saying it. I think another way of saying this is, how engaged are we? I mean, do we even care? Sometimes I worry about that. Like, do you care about, I don't mean that in any morally superior way, but do you have the urge to connect with people? Do you have the urge to connect with your friends? Forget about what you're supposed to be doing, but do you miss them? Are you interested in them? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in our own direction and our own path that we forget that. And I think most of us do care, but it takes work. And it's not productive, so-called. Like, we're not making money and we're not making any big discoveries where we call up and say, I miss you, let's go have a drink, or let's have a cup of coffee, right? I think we need that. All that stuff, I think, is really important.
I personally don't have that urge, but I think it would help me to connect more with people, have meaningful conversations and share moments with them, like other folks, like friends. I think that's something that lots of entrepreneurs lack. I've been directing these masterminds, which are online virtual meetings of CEOs and founders every month. And first, I find that most people don't give a crap about that, while there's an obvious need. It's not even a want, it's a need to have a community around you that you can interact. Maybe it's just it's out of their comfort zone. They prefer crunching work. They calculate the ROI on everything. And then even once they are invited to the mastermind, I find that it's a problem for them to actually show up. You know, there's always another priority. Their brain treats social connection as a want, while I think that it's a need, especially since COVID, you know, this social rift, like we're always against one another. It's so easy to find flaws in the other party rather than understanding them. And that creates that sort of resentment that I felt in myself lately. You also do anger management. So how is anger productive in some ways? For me, it sometimes awake my creative beast and gets me going. It gets shit done, you know. But in other times, it's just like burning my own self. So how can one manage anger productively as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception. I think there's a misconception in the lay public that there are certain emotions that are better than other emotions. Um, from my standpoint, every emotion is created equal. Emotions aren't the problem. Understanding is the problem. So the typical example, right, is that some guy is really mad at his boss, right? And he goes home and he kicks his dog. And then someone says, "Why are you kicking the dog? The dog didn't do anything." He goes, oh, right. I'm not actually angry at the dog. I'm angry at the boss. Right. So it's and anger is a perfectly okay, healthy, normal emotion. The issue is this is a large subject, large, interesting subject. The issue is never emotion, it's how we attribute it. So if you know why you're angry, I mean, you're angry for a reason, right? Emotions never lie. There's always a legitimacy to the emotion. No one can, I say this in my couples all the time, you can't argue someone's experience. You say you're angry. I say, no, you're not. It's like, that's ridiculous. You're angry. But the question is, about what? Is it really about the lack of ice cream? Is it really about the traffic? Is it really about all of that? No, it's never about that. It can be partially about that, but you have to judge the caliber of the emotional response to the incident. And if you're freaking out in traffic and swearing at people and getting in accidents, that's not a good thing. And it's not about the traffic; it's about something else. So I think the short answer to that is, we make more meaning than we know what to do with. These things mean something. It's not just concrete and superficial and cursory. And once we're aware of that, even somewhat, life tends to go better.
And something, it's a deeper reason, whether it's like your partner's habits frustrating you, whether it's you being not on track with your life goals and not being generally happy with the state of your life. Why do you think it's so hard for people to think about the real reason and fix that? Is it because it's such a scary and big elephant in the room that they're scared that their life will break apart if they address it?
Again, I think that's a good question. I think there are many ways to answer that. I think we live in a very unself-reflective culture. We live in a culture that's about immediate gain, immediate progress and money and success and drive. And there are aspects of that that I think are quite good. But I think the downside, and I'm, not to always bash technology, but I do think, and there's lots of research on this, that the neurochemical response to screens and to deluged information on the internet and all of that is like a drug. And this article that I was just reading before I started with you is doing research in teaching kids how to pay attention. I have so many patients who are quite brilliant people, and they've stopped reading. They just don't read, and they don't like it, but they find it really hard to sit down. I don't necessarily mean great literature, but just read anything, because you can just Google it or listen to it, right? And it's not a question of one's good, one's bad, but I think there's a completely different experience when you have to be still and read something than when it's flashing on a screen. So anyway, I think your question can be answered in many different ways. I think it's hard. I think it's hard to take responsibility for yourself. It's hard to understand that you're necessarily having impact on people, whether you realize it or not. It's hard. It takes time. If you're in psychoanalysis, it's expensive. But in the end, I think it's quite practical and to your best interest to know more about why you do the stuff you do.
Right. You're in the District of New York. What are the downsides and the upsides of working with high performers and high achievers as clients?
What's the downside? How could I say that in a diplomat? I mean, first of all, it's hard to generalize, right? It's really hard to generalize. I think what can be the case with CEOs and people who are at their, at their ambitious peak is that it's hard for them not to feel weak when they start looking at their own psychology. It's hard for them because they're used to being the smartest people in the room, or at least they think they are, and they're not that eager to acknowledge that there are things about them that they don't necessarily know much about, right? That I would say that, and then once they get it, and they're into it, but they don't like to have it pointed out to them that they have areas they may need work on, especially if they're particularly good at what they do.
Where can people find out more about you, Dr. Nick?
Well, my as you kindly mentioned at the beginning, my website is nicholas@nicholassamstag.com. I have some stuff I've written there, and I sort of tell you what I'm all about.
There you go. That was Nicholas Samstag and Charles Cormier for another Founder Wisdom podcast.com.